Hello everyone. In today's video, I have a sew along for you. We're going to be sewing MCCALL'S 8030 and I'm going to be demonstrating view C. But if you'd like to sew views A or B instead, you can still follow along. But if you're sewing view A, then you'll have to look at the pattern instructions to insert your collar and the sleeve bands, because I won't be adding those to view C. So this is a really cute button front shirt dress. It's a classic piece, and if you are a beginner, then today is your day, because this is a beginner project. I will be walking you through the entire process step by step with lots of details. But I do want to let you know that I will not be following the order of the pattern instructions. I do things differently, and so you'll notice that when we get started. Just wanted to give you that warning. And then also, if you are part of my private email community, you should be ready. You should have your supplies, because I did send out the email with links to everything that we're using as far as the fabric, the notions, and the pattern in today's sew along. So you should be ready to go. So let's just jump right in and get started. Okay, I'm going to show you a few of the supplies that I'm going to be using, and then a couple of extra tools that will be helpful if you have them. But first, let's take a look at the pattern. So we're using MCCALL'S 8030, and I'm going to be sewing view C with the curved hem. You can sew either view A or B if you prefer. We're going to go through the same steps. The only difference will be the hems. And then if you're sewing view A, there is a collar and sleeve cuffs. I will not be adding sleeve cuffs. So if you decide to do view A with the collar and the sleeve cuffs, then you'll follow the instructions on the that come with the pattern to perform those steps. So this is the one I'm going to be showing you, and we're going to be making the belt also. So for fabric suggestions, the back of the envelope says shirting fabrics, poplin, linen, and seersucker. I'm going to be using this beautiful linen and rayon blend that I purchased from my local Joann Fabrics. It has a lovely drape. You can see the movement when I manipulate it here. It has a beautiful drape, and it's perfect for this dress. Also, you can see that it's the same color color and texture on the back side. So you can use either side. It's the same on the front and the back. So this is a great choice. If you would like to purchase this particular fabric, it comes in multiple colors, and I have linked in the description box for you to check out the fabrics on the Joann's website. You're also going to need interfacing, because we're going to be interfacing the collar stand and the front bands on the dress. So pick up an interfacing that matches the weight of the fabric that you're going to be choosing. So if you're using a lightweight fabric, you want to get a lightweight interfacing. And you can use a woven interfacing since we're using a woven fabric. Now for notions, it calls for 9 half-inch buttons, and then for the belt for views B and C, we're going to need 2 half-inch D-rings. So for my buttons, I picked up these little silver buttons from Joann's. They're by La Mode, and it comes with 5, so I purchased two packs or 2 cards. And yeah, I think this is going to look really cute. And then for the D-rings, I also picked these up from Joann's, and it comes with 2 sets of D-rings. So we're going to be using 2 of the D-rings from this package, and they're 1.5 inch D-rings. Okay. Again, you will be able to find these linked in the description box. And then some of the items, some of the basic tools you'll be able to find in my Amazon store, and that's linked in the description box also. But we're going to be using a point turner, or I'm going to be using a point turner. If you don't have this, you can use not any sharp object, but something that will help you to push out the corners on your collar and at the bottom of the bands, the front bands on the dress. And then for our buttonholes, to open the buttonholes, we're going to be using fray check, and this will help to prevent fraying on your fabric when you're opening up the buttonholes. And then we're going to use this little kit, or I'm going to use this little buttonhole opener kit or set to open the buttonholes. And it's really convenient. This just helps you to get in there with one swipe or two swipes from bottom to top of the buttonhole. And then it comes with this little mat to cut onto. Okay, I'm going to be using this pressing ham when we're pressing our collar stand, just to help get that round, the curve that we want. So you'll see me using it for that. You'll also see me using it when we're pressing the hem on our sleeves. I will slip this into the sleeve opening to press the hem. Before we get started, I want to bring something to your attention about my dress, because you're going to notice it when we're sewing. So I decided to close up my split all the way down to this line right before the curve starts on the hem. This is the marking that you will transfer onto your fabric if you're using the split at the height that they have it. But I didn't want mine that high, so I closed it up. Now, when I'm demonstrating the hem, you're going to follow the exact same procedure. Nothing is going to change. It's just that my split is lower, or I closed up the split. And if you're leaving yours open, you will follow the same steps that I'll be demonstrating. I wanted to bring that to your attention. If you are choosing to close up your split also, then whatever you do to the front, you're going to need to do the same thing to the back. Okay, so you're going to need to sew all the way down, or make your marking. What I did was I made my marking with a chalk roller right across my fabric at this line on the front and on the back, so that I would know this is the point where I'm going to stop sewing to leave the bottom hem open. Okay, we're going to start by preparing the front bands for the dress. You should have transferred the marking onto the front band. We're going to fold over 5/8 of an inch, and you can use your seam gauge to measure that off. You're going to fold over 5/8 of an inch. And then we're going to press that in place. I do suggest using a press cloth just to protect your fabric. And then we're going to just continue folding over, measuring up the 5/8 of an inch, or you can eyeball it if you like, across the entire length of the band and press that down. And after we have it all pressed, we're going to cut away about 1/4 of an inch of the seam allowance, leaving 3/8 of an inch. Okay, then we're going to set this apart, or set this aside, and start on our collar stand. So you're going to take your collar stand with the wrong side facing up. On the top you have the double notches, and then on the bottom you have a single notch. So we're going to be folding up our seam allowance on the bottom. So you're going to measure off 5/8 of an inch, and we're just going to fold up 5/8, and then we're going to press that in place. Then I'm going to move over to the edge, and same thing, measure up 5/8 of an inch, and then we're going to press. And we're going to continue this method across the entire length of the collar stand. And after we have the collar stand all pressed, we're gonna cut away the seam allowance the same way we did for the front bands. Now we're going to attach the collar stand to the collar stand facing. So I'm going to take the collar stand facing and place it with the right side facing up. And then I have the collar stand with the right side facing down. And then we're going to pin these two pieces together. And I'm starting at the double notches. So match the double notches at the top edge on both sides. And then I'm going to go to the sides and pin them together because I want to make sure that the raw edges are even on this curve. So we're going to pin that together, making sure that that curve is matched. And then I'm going to go over and pin the collar stand to the fold on the collar facing. So that's what it looks like. And then we're going to go over to the other side and do the same thing. Okay, now we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a stitch all the way around from one end to the other. And we'll be starting our stitch right at the fold. So we're actually going to sew with the facing side up and start at that fold and all the way around. Okay, now we're going to trim away some of the seam allowance on the collar stand to remove some of the excess bulk before we turn it right side out. So I'm going to trim away about half. Okay, now we're going to turn it right side out and we're going to go to the pressing station, folding the collar stand along the seam, and then we're going to press it flat. Okay, now we're going to make our belt, and you should have transferred this line onto the wrong side of your belt piece, but we're going to need to see that line when we get ready to press over the fold, so you can actually transfer it onto the right side of your belt piece if you want, or you can wait until later, which I'm going to be transferring the line while we're pressing. So fold your belt piece together along the long edge, and then we're just going to go down the length of the belt and pin it together, making sure that your raw edges are even. Then we're going to sew a seam down the length of the belt, leaving an opening on the end with the fold line. We're going to trim away the seam allowance, and I'm starting at the point. I'm just going to cut diagonally, and then we're going to just trim away most of that seam allowance. Okay, then you'll need to turn the tube right side out. And the method I use is I just turn it with my fingers. So I'll just open it up and then I'll grab a piece and then pull like that. Okay, and once you reach the end, you can go ahead and push out the corners. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert my point turner. And I'm going to use that to push out my corners. Okay, and then I'm going to go to the pressing station, and then we're just going to press it flat right along that seam. And continue pressing across the full length of the belt. Next, we're going to draw our fold line onto the belt. If you did this on the wrong side, it's okay. You can just do it again on the right side, and you can use your pattern piece to see how much to measure over and just draw a line right onto that edge. I used my Clover chalk roller. Next, we're going to measure off 1/4 of an inch to fold over and press the raw edge in. Then we're going to fold right along the line that we marked onto the fabric, and we're going to press that down. I'm using my tailor's clapper to fill in that press so that I get a nice crisp fold. Okay, now that we have our fold pressed in, we're going to attach the D-rings. So we're going to take both of them and just feed them through. And I'm going to hand sew my fold onto the belt. You can use your machine if you'd like. If you're going to use your machine, then just go ahead and pin that if you need to, and just sew right across that fold. Okay, we're going to prepare our dress front pieces and our dress back before we attach the yokes. Now, you should have transferred these 2 markings onto both of your dress fronts on the wrong side of the fabric and your dress back. And what we're going to do is we're going to sew a basting stitch, 2 rows of basting stitches between these 2 markings. And we're going to use the basting stitches to gather the fabric in between this area, because we're going to need to fit the dress onto the yoke, and the yoke is shorter than the dress at the top. Okay, now we're ready to construct the dress fronts. So I have 1 dress front, 1 yoke front, and 1 pocket piece. Now I'm going to start with the pocket piece. So we have a notch, a single notch on the side of the dress and a single notch on the pocket. So we're going to match those notches together and pin the pocket to the dress. And then we'll continue pinning from one end to the other, making sure that our raw edges are even. And something I like to do to keep my pocket out of the way while I'm sewing this stitch is to tack the pocket down onto the dress temporarily. Okay, and now for the yoke. So we have our basting stitches at the top of the dress, and then we have our yoke. So we have the dress with the right side facing up, and we're going to take the yoke with the right side facing down. And we have a single notch on the dress and a single notch on the yoke, and we're going to pin those or match those and then pin the yoke to the dress. Then we'll go over to one edge, making sure that the raw edges are even along the side and the top. And then we'll do the same thing on the other end. These two markings on your yoke, you're going to match those two markings to the markings on your dress. And that's where your basting stitches end on the dress. Okay, now you see that we have extra. Let me place another pin here. Keep that together and flat. Okay, we have extra fabric on the dress, and that's why we put the basting stitches in, because we're going to pull the basting stitches together to ease this fabric in to fit the yoke. And I'm going to turn it over so that the dress side is facing up. And I'm going to take two strands of thread, and I'm just going to pull and gather those threads using my finger or my thumb to distribute the gathers in that area. And then I'm going to pull two threads from the other side and do the same thing. And then we're going to pin the dress onto the yoke. We're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew a stitch from one end all the way across to the other. Next, we're going to attach the yoke back to the dress back. So we're looking at the dress back with the right sides facing up. I'm going to take the yoke back with the bottom of the yoke back facing the top edge of the yoke dress, or the dress back, and with the yoke facing down, the right side of the yoke facing down. And we're going to align the marks on the yoke to the marks on the dress. And then we're just going to pin on both sides. And then you can go and pin the rest of the yoke to the dress. Now, once we have the yoke attached to the dress, we're going to turn it over, pull up our basting stitches. We're going to go to the machine and we're going to stitch from one end all the way over to the other. Now we're going to press the seam allowance on the dress front up towards the yoke. Then we're going to press the seam on the pocket flat. Then we're going to press the seam allowance for the pocket towards the pocket. Okay, so this is what our front pieces should look like after we've attached the yoke in the pocket. And then I'll bring over the back to show you. Let me move the front. This is the back. And it's the same as the front. Okay, here it is from the other side. All right, and the right side facing down. Okay. And I'm going to start at the notches right here below the underarm. We have double notches, so let's pin that together. And then we'll move toward the sleeve, the underarm area of the sleeve. We'll move down to make sure that the pockets are aligned properly. So I'm pinning right where that seam starts and right where the raw edges meet for the pocket. We want to make sure that that is aligned evenly. Okay, and I'll go and place a pin in between here. I'm going to go down. We'll come back to the pockets. I'm going to go down to the bottom of the skirt. Now remember, I am not leaving, or I'm not using the marking that they had on the dress for my split because I don't want the high split. I have marked down to the bottom where the skirt where the hem starts to curve, and I've created new marks for my skirt. So I'm going to pin there first because that's where I'm going to end my stitching. And then I'll go and pin in between, making sure that the raw edges are even. And then again, I'm going to make sure that the seams and the raw edges of both pocket pieces are matching. Okay. Now we're going to go and pin our pockets together. Just make sure that they're even all the way around. Okay, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew from one end to the marking for the where the pocket ends. Then we're going to break our stitching, and then we'll go and continue starting where this pocket ends all the way down to wherever you will be stopping for your dress. I'm going to sew down to the marking that I've placed here. Okay, and then we're going to come back up, and then we're going to sew around the pocket edge. Next, we're going to attach the fronts to the back at the shoulder seams. So we have the right side of the back facing up, and then we have the right side of the front facing down. We're going to place those together and then pin them in place. I'm going to start at the edge. I'm going to match the notches. We have single notches on the shoulders of the front and back. And then I'm going to match the other edge. And you have little marks on the front and the back. Okay, we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew the shoulders together from one end to the other on both sides, and then we'll sew the side seams together all at the same time. Now we're going to go back and reinforce the underarm seam by sewing another row of stitching directly on top of the first row of stitching. And you're just going to do that around the curve. Okay, now that we have our dress attached at the side seams and the shoulders, we're going to do a little clipping into the seam allowances in a couple of places. So first we're going to clip into the seam allowance at the underarm seam. And the reason we're doing this is to release some of to release this curve so that when we're wearing the dress, we don't get bunching in this area from the fabric being too tight. So we're going to clip a little triangle right here in this area, and that's going to open that seam up so that when you are wearing the dress and your arms are hanging flat, hanging down, you don't get puckering in this area. So right in the curved area, we're just going to clip a triangle. And that's going to help that to hang better. And then we need to clip the back seam allowance for the pocket. So we're looking at the dress from the front. We're going to flip it over to the back. And then we're going to clip the seam allowance below the pocket on the back seam allowance only. Not the front, just the back. We're going to clip through right up to the seam, and then we're going to do the same thing above or at the top of the pocket. The back seam allowance only, we're just going to clip. And what that does is it helps to turn your pocket to the front when you're wearing the dress. Okay? And starting at the edge of the armhole, I'm going to serge my seam allowance, and I'm going to serge right off the edge where we clipped in to the seam allowance. And then I'm going to continue on the other edge. Okay, so here I am inserting the seam allowance again to continue serging. And I'm going to serge off right where that fabric cut, where that notch is. And I'm going to stop with my needle down. I'm going to lift my presser foot and then pull that fabric off to the left side. Okay, so here is the bottom of my dress where I marked up or made the marking where I want to stop my stitching before the hem starts. And I want to serge the seam allowance above the hem. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to clip into my seam allowance about ½ inch above that marking. And then I'm going to use my serger to continue serging the rest of the seam allowance. And then I'll have the open seam for the hem. So I'm going to insert from the bottom and just continue serging off the side seam. And again, I'm going to serge off right where that notch is on the fabric. I'm going to serge right off the side. Okay, now I want to serge the edges of my pockets because my fabric does fray. So I'm going to serge the pockets, and I'm going to start in at an angle, and then I'm going to turn the pocket straight. So I'm inserting it at an angle. I'm going to go in a couple of stitches and then turn it straight. I'm going to serge right off that edge and moving the seam allowance out of the way. Okay, now we're going to press, or actually before we press, because I serged my seams together, I need to release that pocket because I want the seam allowance to press toward the back. But because the pocket is folded toward the front, the seam allowance will go with it. So if you are pressing your seams open, you won't have to do this. But because I serged mine together, this is what I'm going to have to do. So I'm clipping into the seam allowance to release the seam allowances above and below the pocket. And now I'm going to press the seam allowances above and below the pocket toward the back of the dress, making sure not to press in the hem seam allowances. We're going to do that separately. Okay, I'm going to use my seam roll to press the seam allowance on the sleeve. If you don't have a seam roll, you can do this on your ironing board. It just helps me to get into that sleeve. And now I'm pressing the seams flat on the shoulder. And then I'm going to use my seam roll again to press the shoulder seams toward the back of the dress. I've already pinned, and then we're going to pin the top. Now, I don't know what happened, but my front band came up short, and I think it's because I made the adjustment to the front of the dress, but I did not make an adjustment to the band. But I'm going to make it work. You won't have this issue because your band will fit your dress. So I'm just going to go with what I have. We're going to continue pinning the band to the front of the dress. Okay, we're going to go to the sewing machine and just sew a straight stitch from one end all the way down to the other. Okay, now we're going to press our facing. I have my facing flat onto the ironing board, and we're just going to press that seam flat. Continue along the entire length of your facing. Now we're going to fold the seam allowance and press it toward the band. Now we're going to fold the band over, aligning it right with the seam. And then we're going to press that in place. And we'll continue pressing the band along the entire length. This is where we are so far. We've attached the bands to the front of the dress, and now we're going to work on the neckline. So we're going to insert stay stitching around the entire neckline, and that's going to prevent the neckline from stretching out of shape while we're attaching the collar stand. Now, if you are attaching the collar stand and the collar, then you'll need to follow the instructions on the pattern, because I'm only attaching the collar stand. But either way, we still need to insert the stay stitching around the neckline. Okay, now we're going to attach the collar stand to the neck edge of the dress. So we're going to start at the shoulder seams on the dress, and you have 2 markings on your collar stand. So you're going to match the markings to the shoulder seams. Open out your collar stand. Then we're going to go over and match the notches on the collar stand to the notches on the neckline. Then I'm going to go over to the edge, and I'm going to match the edge of my collar stand to the edge of the band on the dress. Making sure that you don't pin in the fold. Then we're going to go to the sewing machine, and we're going to sew a seam from one end all the way over to the other. Okay, next we're going to trim away some of the seam allowance. All right, we're going to go to our pressing station and press the seam toward the collar stand. And I'm using my tailor's ham to press the seam allowance because there's a curve in the collar, and the tailor's ham really does help to form that curve as you're pressing. If you don't have a tailor's ham, it's okay. You can press yours right on your ironing board. But if you do have it, it's helpful. You see how I'm forming it around curved on the tailor's hem? It's very helpful. Okay, continue pressing around the entire collar stand. And then we're going to take the seam allowance from the band and we're going to insert it into the collar stand, concealing the raw edge. And then we're just going to go ahead and pin across the length of the collar stand. And I'm going to turn these pins instead of pinning horizontal because I'm actually going to hand stitch my collar. Okay, I'm hand stitching my collar because it gives me more control, but you are free to use your sewing machine. So to start my hand stitching, I just insert my needle right on the edge and making a knot on the end of the thread first, and then I'm gonna go through. So I've taken up a stitch on the seam allowance of the dress, and then I'm gonna take a stitch through the fold of the fabric. And I think I took up about 1/2 inch or maybe a little less. You can do smaller stitches if you like, if you choose to hand stitch your collar. But you see, I'm just inserting the needle right through that fold. I'm creating an invisible stitch. And then I'm going to take up a tiny stitch on that seam allowance, or right at the thread, take up a tiny stitch. Now, usually you're taking up a couple of threads, but because I'm using a thread that's identical to the color of my dress, I'm not worried about any show through. And plus I'm taking up my stitch right on the edge of the seam allowance. Again, I'm going to take up a stitch through the fold, and then I'm going to take up another stitch, a tiny stitch through the seam allowance. And this is how I started the seam. So after I knotted the edge of the fabric and went in on the edge, I took up a stitch on the fabric or on the seam allowance first, and then I sewed through or took up a stitch inside the fold. And you will continue that all the way across the collar, and then at the end, when you get to the other end, you're going to take up a final stitch and then tie a knot. Okay, we've attached our collar stand, and now we're going to do some edge stitching. So on the collar stand, I'm going to be edge stitching along the top edge of the collar stand, and I'm going to edge stitch, or we're going to edge stitch the edge of the front bands, and we're going to edge stitch from the top all the way down to the bottom, but we're going to stop 5 inches above the bottom edge, and that's because we're going to turn this right side spacing to start our hem. Before edge stitching, I used my seam gauge to mark up 5 inches from the bottom edge of the front band so that I will know where to stop my edge stitching. Okay, now we're ready to start sewing our hems. So first we're going to take our front bands and turn them wrong side out. So open up your front band and then you're going to turn it and fold it over with the right side facing, and you're lining up the pressed edge with the seam here. And we're going to pin that. And then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a seam across the band 5/8 of an inch up from the raw edge. And you're going to do that on both bands. Okay, now we're going to trim away the seam allowance, but we're only trimming away a portion of the seam allowance on the dress side. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to clip in a little square. So I'm going to go from the edge and do just a little snip. Okay, and then I'm going to snip and see I've cut out a little square. Now I'm going to cut away the seam allowance or the rest of the seam allowance on the band, but not on the band on the dress side. And the reason I want to leave that is because when I turn it to the inside, I want to make sure that I have fabric to go underneath there, because if I clip it all the way to the band, if I clip the dress fabric all the way to the edge, when I turn this over, I'm going to have that raw edge hanging out, and we don't want that. Okay, now we're ready to turn our seam, or turn the band to the inside, or to the inside. And you see we have the bottom hem folds up naturally and it goes inside. And I'm just going to use my seam gauge to push out that corner. Did you know that you can use this little point on your seam gauge to push out corners? It works really well. Okay, so we have a nice point there. We'll do the same thing on the other side. And we have a nice point. Okay, now we're going to go to our sewing machine and we're going to insert a row of basting stitches, or a basting stitch, one row, right along the bottom edge, 1/4 of an inch in from the raw edge, all the way around. And we're going to use the basting stitch to help to ease in the fabric when we get ready to press over the hem. Okay, now we're going to hem the dress, and what we're going to do is take those basting stitches and we're going to pull and gather the bottom edge of the dress. And what we're doing is we're creating a curve to help us press in, or to press up the seam allowance without having a bunch of puckers. And you'll have to just take your time on this and just distribute the gathers. And then you see how it just naturally folds up. And then we're going to measure up 5/8 of an inch for the hem allowance. And then we're going to press. And we're making sure that that seam allowance above the curve is pressed open and flat. And then after we've pressed around, we're going to go ahead and insert or turn the raw edges in to that fold. And then we're going to press that in place. We're creating a narrow hem. Okay, we have our hems pressed and ready to go. So what we're going to do is go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew right along the inner edge of the hem where that fold ends. And we're going to sew all the way around. And then we're going to square off where this split ends. And it doesn't matter how high or low your split is, you get to determine the length of your split. It is going to be the same procedure. We're going to sew up along that edge, and then we're going to pivot and then sew across this raw edge, and then continue going around, all the way around the hem. Okay, our next step will be finishing off the front bands. We're going to stitch those down onto the dress with an edge stitch. So we're going to start at the bottom. Let me turn this around. We're going to start at the bottom, but I'm going to start above the hem. So I'm not going to start my edge stitching here because there's a lot of bulk in this area because of all of the folds. I'm going to use my hand needle and I'm going to stitch that down. I'm going to stitch this band down onto the hem, just where the hem ends. And then we're going to start stitching on the machine with the edge stitch right along this fold, the edge of the band. And your stitching is going to be just inside, just to the right of that fold. And we're going to go from the bottom all the way to the top, and we're going to stop right where the collar and the band intersect. Okay? And also, remember we stopped 5 inches above the hem, the raw edge, when we top stitched or when we edge stitched here. You can go ahead now and continue that edge stitching from the point where you stopped all the way down to right before the fold, before the hem. Now, you can do that on your own. And then finally, We're going to do all of this at the same time. We're going to sew a basting stitch. We're going to sew a 5/8 inch basting stitch all the way around. And that's going to help to guide us when we press up the fold for our hem on the sleeve. Okay? Now we're going to press up our hem on the sleeve, and we're going to use the basting stitch to turn the fabric to the inside right along the fold of the basting stitches, and we're going to press that in place. And I'm using my tailor's hem again. And we're going to continue pressing up that hem allowance all the way around. And then again, we're going to turn the raw edge in to create our narrow hem. And then we're going to press that in place all the way around the sleeve. And when we're done, we're going to go to the machine and stitch in our hem by sewing right along that inner fold. Okay, the last thing that we need to do is add our buttonholes to the dress. So you will align your buttonhole guide onto the right side, the right band from the top to the bottom, and you're just going to make sure that the top edge of your band or your buttonhole guide is right at the seam where the collar meets. You're going to line that up and then transfer the markings onto the right band. I've transferred mine, and then we're going to go to the machine and we're going to sew in our buttons or our buttonholes. And then you can use your collar stand pattern piece to align it with or to sew the buttonhole on your collar. So let's go to the machine. I'll do one buttonhole, and then you will just go ahead and sew in all of your buttonholes. Okay, now we're going to open up the buttonholes. But before you open your buttonholes, I highly suggest sealing off the threads or the buttonholes using fray check. Fray check prevents the fabric from fraying once you cut through the buttonholes, once you cut them open. So what I did is squeezed fray check, completely saturating the area in between the stitches on the front and on the back, and then let that dry completely. After it's dry, I'm using my buttonhole opener set, and I'm going to place the pad underneath, and then I'm going to use the blade to cut open in between the threads. And then I'll go down to the other end, making sure that I'm not cutting the threads. And there you have it. Our buttonhole is open, okay, on the front and the back. Now, to add your buttons, we're going to overlap the right band over the left band, and we're going to align those perfectly, and then we're going to position our buttons. So I'm going to just place a straight pin through the center of my buttonhole and push it through. I'm going to pull that out, and that's where I'm going to sew on my button. So you'll do that with all of your buttonholes, and then you'll go back and hand sew your buttons, or if your machine has a special feature where you can use your a presser foot, a special presser foot, you can use your machine to sew on the buttons. Okay, and then after that, we will be done. Well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the sew along. If so, make sure you hit the like button down below. And if you'd like to see more photos of the dress, both inside and out, then there is a blog post and there's a link in the description box that will take you directly to that post. And you will get to see close-up photos of the inside and outside of the dress. Now, if you're not a member of my private email community, I highly recommend that you join if you're interested in receiving advanced notification emails for future sew-alongs. In those emails, I include direct links to the pattern, the fabric, and the notions that we will be using for the sew-along. So you can tap the link in my description box that says join my community. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.